There is a city on the northwest coast of England that has been defined, for most of the world, by 4 young men from its streets who changed music forever, by a football club that has won more European trophies than any other in England, and by a waterfront that has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city markets these things well. It markets the Beatles, the football, the regenerated docks, the culture, the humour, the specific warmth of the people. What it markets less prominently is the other story. The story of how that waterfront was built. The story of what the port economy cost the people it transported and the people who worked it. The story of a government that looked at Liverpool in 1981 and quietly decided it was not worth saving. The story of a stadium disaster whose truth was suppressed for 23 years while the city's people were publicly blamed for the deaths of their own. In this video, we are counting down 13 dark truths about Liverpool that the tourist board, the city council, and the heritage industry have been consistently quiet about. Not the Liverpool of the Beatles and the Liver Building and the Grand National. The Liverpool of the slave trade and the Toxteth riots, and the Hillsborough cover-up, and the managed decline memorandum that a British government wrote about this city and hid for 30 years. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a document that sat in a government archive for 30 years that described a deliberate policy of allowing a British city to fail, and that was signed by a minister who has never been held accountable for what it recommended. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. The Liverpool waterfront is magnificent. The Three Graces, the Liver Building, the Cunard Building, the Port of Liverpool Building represent some of the finest Edwardian commercial architecture in Britain. The Albert Dock, restored in the 1980s, houses the Merseyside Maritime Museum, the Tate Liverpool, and the Museum of Liverpool. The waterfront is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was built on the wealth generated by the Port of Liverpool, which was, for most of the 18th century, the largest slave trading port in the world. Between 1699 and 1807, when the slave trade was abolished, Liverpool ships transported approximately 1.4 million enslaved people from the west coast of Africa to the Americas. This figure represents approximately 40% of the entire British slave trade and approximately 10% of the entire transatlantic slave trade. The wealth generated by Liverpool's role in the slave trade funded the banks, the insurance companies, the merchants' houses, and the civic infrastructure that made the city. The families whose portraits hang in the Walker Art Gallery, whose names are on the streets of the Georgian Quarter, whose legacies funded the civic institutions of Victorian Liverpool, were in many cases the families of slave merchants. The Merseyside Maritime Museum has an international slavery museum that is genuinely one of the best representations of the slave trade's history in Britain. This is to Liverpool's credit. The question of the relationship between the slave trade and the specific architectural heritage that UNESCO designated, the relationship between the wealth of enslaved people's labor and the buildings that tourists photograph, is a question that the heritage presentation addresses less directly than the museum does. The Port of Liverpool was, for most of its history, operated on a system of casual labor. Dockers did not have permanent employment. They gathered at the dock gates each morning to be selected for work by a foreman who chose, on a day-by-day basis, who would work and who would not. The system was called the shape-up. The men who were not chosen on a given day did not work and did not earn. The power relationship between the foreman and the dockers was total. A man who had made himself inconvenient could find himself consistently not chosen. The shape-up system operated in Liverpool docks from the 19th century until 1967, when the Devlin Report led to the decasualisation of dock labour and the introduction of permanent employment for registered dockers. Between the establishment of the shape-up system and its abolition in 1967, generations of Liverpool dock workers lived with the daily uncertainty of whether they would be chosen to work. Their wives managed household economies on incomes that could not be predicted from one week to the next. The communities that grew up around the docks were built on the specific social and economic conditions that the shape-up created. The decasualization of 1967 resolved the shape-up system. It also, by creating a registered workforce with permanent employment rights, created the conditions for the mechanization of the docks that subsequently reduced the dock workforce dramatically. The containerization of shipping in the 1970s and 1980s completed this process. The dock community that had built its life around the labor of the port was dismantled by the mechanization that permanent employment rights had made easier to introduce. The men who had fought for security of employment found that security came at the price of the employment itself. In July 1981, serious riots occurred in the Toxteth area of Liverpool. For 9 nights, running battles between police and residents resulted in hundreds of injuries, significant property damage, and the first use of CS gas by police on mainland Britain. The riots followed years of tension between Merseyside police and the predominantly black and mixed heritage community of Toxteth, a community that experienced policing practices widely described as discriminatory and aggressive. The immediate trigger was the arrest of a young black man by police officers in what residents said was a routine example of the kind of policing their community routinely experienced. The government's response to the Toxteth riots included a visit to Liverpool by the Environment Secretary Michael Heseltine, who proposed a program of investment and regeneration, the Garden Festival of 1984, and various urban regeneration initiatives. What the public did not know at the time was that another response to the Toxteth riots was also being discussed within the cabinet. In a memorandum written by Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and circulated within the cabinet in 1981, Howe argued that the investment Heseltine was proposing for Liverpool was likely to be wasted, that the city's economic problems were too deep for regeneration investment to address, and that a policy of managed decline was the more honest approach. The memorandum was classified. It was released in 2011 under the 30-year rule. Its existence and its specific recommendation that Liverpool be allowed to decline rather than invested in is one of the most significant revelations about the Thatcher government's attitude toward Liverpool and its people. No minister has ever been held accountable for writing or circulating it. In September 1995, 500 Liverpool dock workers were sacked after refusing to cross a picket line at the Mersey Docks and Harbour Company. The dismissals began what became a 28-month dispute that was simultaneously one of the most significant and one of the least publicly acknowledged industrial disputes in Britain in the 1990s. The dispute attracted international solidarity, with dock workers in ports from Los Angeles to Japan refusing to handle Liverpool cargo. It produced some of the most creative and innovative labour organising seen in Britain in a generation, and it ended in defeat. The dockers voted in February 1998 to accept the terms offered, which did not include reinstatement for most of the sacked workers. The Mersey Docks and Harbour Company was never required to reinstate the workers it had sacked for refusing to cross a picket line. The dispute illustrated the specific legal framework governing trade union activity that had been constructed in Britain since 1979, a framework that made secondary action, the solidarity action of other workers in support of the Liverpool dockers, effectively illegal. The international support that sustained the Liverpool dockers, the dock workers in Los Angeles and Japan and elsewhere who refused to handle Liverpool cargo, was legal in their countries. It was illegal in Britain. The British workers who wanted to show solidarity could not do so without exposing themselves and their unions to legal action. The Liverpool dockers lost the dispute. The dock community that had its roots in the casual labour of the shape-up system, that had fought for decasualization in 1967, that had survived containerization in the 1970s and 1980s, did not survive the 1995 sackings. The community of Liverpool dock workers, which had defined a significant part of the city's identity for 2 centuries, effectively ended in February 1998. This channel has covered the Hillsborough disaster in 2 previous videos, in the video on British institutions that got away with it, and in the video on dark British cases the police walked away from. The decision to include Hillsborough in this Liverpool video is deliberate. because the Hillsborough story is not only a story about South Yorkshire police and the cover-up they mounted. It is also a story about what Liverpool's people were put through, specifically, for 23 years. The false narrative that South Yorkshire police constructed and that The Sun published under the headline The Truth, which blamed the fans who died for their own deaths, was not an abstract institutional failure. It was experienced, day by day, by the families of the 97 who died, by the survivors, and by the wider Liverpool community. The Sun was boycotted in Liverpool from the day of that publication. The boycott has continued. Decades after the false narrative was retracted, after the independent panel confirmed the cover-up, after the second inquest returned a verdict of unlawful killing, The Sun remains the only major British national newspaper that cannot be openly sold in significant parts of Liverpool. The Sun's editor at the time of the original publication, Kelvin Mackenzie, issued an apology in 2012 and retracted it in 2017. No criminal conviction for the cover-up, the false narrative, or the deaths themselves has been produced. Liverpool's people lived with the public accusation that they had killed their own for 23 years. That specific experience, the experience of a community being told that its loved ones died because of their own behavior, while the truth was known by those suppressing it, belongs in a video about Liverpool specifically, because it happened to Liverpool specifically. The Liverpool Overhead Railway was the world's first electrically operated elevated railway. It opened in 1893 and ran along the waterfront, connecting the dock areas from Dingle in the south to Seaforth in the north. For 60 years, it was the primary means of transport for the dock workers of Liverpool, carrying them between the residential areas and the various sections of the port. It was also the only public railway in the world from which passengers could watch the loading and unloading of ocean-going ships. It was known locally as the Docker's Umbrella because its elevated structure provided shelter in the rain for those working and waiting on the docks below. In 1956, the Liverpool Overhead Railway Company announced that the structure required major repairs that the company could not afford. An application for public funding was made to Liverpool City Council. The council declined. The railway closed on the 30th of December 1956. It was demolished in 1957. The decision to allow the Liverpool Overhead Railway to close was a decision made on financial grounds, without an adequate assessment of what the railway provided to the dock community and to the wider Liverpool transport network. Transport planners in subsequent decades have repeatedly identified the corridor that the overhead railway served as a transport need that has never been adequately met by the road network that replaced it. The Merseyrail network that now serves Liverpool does not serve the waterfront corridor that the overhead railway served. The specific transport need that the world's first elevated electric railway met and that its demolition created has not been resolved in the 67 years since the railway was demolished. And hey, before we reach the final 6, if this video is showing you a Liverpool that the city's promotional materials have been consistently careful around, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks they know this city, because what follows is the part of Liverpool's story that the Northern regeneration narrative has found most difficult. Now, let's continue. On the 29th of May 1985, 39 people died at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels before the European Cup final between Liverpool and Juventus, when a wall collapsed after crowd disorder that began in a neutral section between the two sets of supporters. The disorder that led to the deaths has been the subject of sustained and complex historical debate. What is not debated is that 39 people died, that the majority of them were Italian, and that Liverpool supporters were involved in the crowd movement that preceded the wall's collapse. English clubs were banned from European competition for 5 years following Heysel. Liverpool's ban was extended to 6 years. The specific question of accountability for what happened at Heysel is complicated by the condition of the stadium, which had been identified as inadequate for a major European final, but was used anyway, and by the complexity of the crowd disorder that preceded the collapse. But Heysel belongs in this video because it is a part of Liverpool's history that the city's football identity has found difficult to integrate into its self-presentation in the same way that Hillsborough has been integrated. Heysel happened. 39 people died. They were predominantly Italian. The connection between what Liverpool supporters did at Heysel and the deaths of those 39 people has never been processed in Liverpool's public discourse with the same directness that Liverpool has applied to the injustices it experienced at Hillsborough. In the early 1980s, Liverpool City Council was controlled by a faction of the Labour Party called Militant Tendency. The militant-led council, under the effective leadership of Derek Hatton, pursued a confrontational strategy with the Thatcher government that resulted in the council setting an illegal budget in 1985 and issuing redundancy notices to the entire council workforce. The militant period in Liverpool was an attempt to use municipal power to resist the impact of Thatcherite cuts on one of Britain's most economically deprived cities. It was also characterized by practices that subsequent investigation found included political patronage in housing allocation, intimidation of opponents, and financial management that was inadequately accountable. The Labour Party ultimately expelled the militant leaders from the party. The council adopted a legal budget. Derek Hatton was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud in 1993, a conviction subsequently overturned on appeal. The militant period in Liverpool politics polarizes opinion between those who see it as a courageous, if flawed, resistance to Thatcherite cuts and those who see it as an episode of political extremism that damaged the city's governance and its relationship with central government. What is less often discussed is the specific impact of the militant period on ordinary Liverpool residents. The housing allocation practices that favoured political supporters, the intimidation of councillors who disagreed with the leadership, and the use of Liverpool's most deprived communities as the terrain for a political battle between the council and central government, in which the communities themselves had limited power to determine the outcome. In July 2021, the Liverpool waterfront was removed from the UNESCO World Heritage List. The decision was made because Liverpool City Council had approved developments in and around the waterfront. Most significantly, the Everton FC Stadium development at Bramley Moor Dock, that UNESCO and ICOMOS, the international body advising UNESCO on heritage sites, had assessed as incompatible with World Heritage status. The removal of Liverpool's waterfront from the World Heritage List was the third time in UNESCO history that a site had been removed from the list, and the first time a site in a developed Western country had been removed. The decision attracted significant controversy in Liverpool and nationally. Proponents of the Everton Stadium development argued that economic and community development should not be subordinated to heritage preservation. UNESCO and its advisors argued that the specific developments approved by Liverpool City Council were incompatible with the outstanding universal value that had justified the waterfront's inscription on the list. The question of whether a city with Liverpool's economic history, a city that had been the subject of a government-managed decline memorandum and that had experienced sustained economic deprivation, should be required to preserve its Victorian industrial heritage at the expense of economic development, is a genuine and difficult question. The answer to that question, and the specific planning decisions that produced it, resulted in Liverpool becoming only the third site in UNESCO history to lose World Heritage status, and the first in the developed world. The waterfront is still magnificent. It is no longer World Heritage. The Liverpool Care Pathway for the Dying Patient was a medical protocol developed at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital in the 1990s and subsequently adopted across NHS hospitals in England and Wales as a framework for end-of-life care. It was intended to provide a dignified, comfortable death for patients who were in the final hours or days of life. By the early 2010s, however, significant concerns had emerged about the way the pathway was being implemented in practice. The concerns included allegations that patients were being placed on the pathway without the knowledge or consent of their families, that patients were being sedated and have fluids withheld in ways that may have hastened death rather than managing its comfort, and that some patients placed on the pathway had not in fact been imminently dying. An independent review led by Baroness Julia Neuberger, published in 2013, found that the Liverpool care pathway had been misused in some cases, that financial incentives for hospitals that met targets for pathway use had created perverse incentives, and that the lack of communication with families had caused significant distress. The pathway was subsequently phased out and replaced with individual end-of-life care plans. The association of the Liverpool care pathway with Liverpool, through the name it carried, created a specific reputational dimension for the city in the coverage of the scandal. The scandal was about NHS implementation practices nationally. The name attached it to Liverpool specifically. The pathway had been developed in good faith to address a genuine clinical need. The implementation failures were not specific to Liverpool, but the name meant that the controversy was Liverpool's to carry in a way that the specific implementation failures did not warrant. The relationship between Liverpool and the Sun newspaper is one of the most sustained acts of civic resistance in British media history. When the Sun published its front page on the 19th of April 1989, 3 days after the Hillsborough disaster, accusing Liverpool fans of pickpocketing the dead, urinating on police officers, and attacking a police constable giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the city of Liverpool responded with a boycott that has now lasted over 35 years. The specific allegations were fabricated. They were based on a briefing from South Yorkshire Police to a press agency, and the agency's copy was edited and inflamed by the Sun's editor, Kelvin Mackenzie, before publication. When the Hillsborough Independent Panel confirmed in 2012 that the allegations were false and that the South Yorkshire Police briefing had been the source, the Sun published a front-page apology. Mackenzie issued a personal apology. In 2017, Mackenzie retracted his apology, saying he had been misled by South Yorkshire Police and should not have apologised personally. The Sun's apology was not retracted, but the partial withdrawal of Mackenzie's personal apology, 33 years after the original publication, in the year before the criminal trials of former police officers were due to begin, was experienced in Liverpool as a further act of bad faith. The boycott has continued. News UK, the company that owns The Sun, has not found a way to restore the newspaper's presence in the city. The boycott represents the refusal of an entire city to accept a publication that printed fabricated allegations about its people and has never, in the view of those who maintain the boycott, adequately accounted for doing so. This channel covered Capel Celyn in the video on UK towns the government erased. The Welsh village drowned in 1965 to supply Liverpool with water. Every Welsh MP voted against the bill that authorised the drowning. The bill passed anyway, because English MPs were the majority. The community was dispersed. The Welsh language lost another community in which it had been the first language of daily life. Liverpool City Council did not apologise for the flooding until 2005, 40 years after the event. This channel has told that story. What belongs in this Liverpool video is the Liverpool side of that story. The decision to flood Capel Celyn was made by Liverpool Corporation, the body that governed the city of Liverpool, in pursuit of Liverpool's water supply needs. The engineers and planners who identified the Tryweryn Valley as the most suitable location for a reservoir knew they were identifying a Welsh-speaking community as the cost of Liverpool's water supply. The politicians who promoted the private bill in Parliament knew they were overriding the unanimous opposition of Welsh elected representatives. The decision was legal, the process was parliamentary, and the cost, the destruction of a Welsh-speaking community, the dispersal of its people, the loss of the language in that specific place, was borne by 70 people in a Welsh valley who had no vote on the matter and no mechanism for stopping what was being done to them. Liverpool's water still comes partly from the Tryweryn Valley. The reservoir built on the drowned village is called Llyn Celyn. The apology came in 2005. The cofich, remember, remains painted on walls across Wales. Liverpool's role in what happened at Capel Celyn is not a prominent part of how Liverpool talks about itself. We open this video with the Managed Decline memorandum. We end with its full story. In September 1981, 2 months after the Toxteth riots, Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Margaret Thatcher's government, wrote a memorandum to the Cabinet. The memorandum was titled Merseyside. It was marked confidential. It ran to several pages. It argued that the government's response to the Toxteth riots, particularly the Heysel-led investment programme that was being proposed for Liverpool, was misguided. Howe's argument was that Liverpool's economic problems were too structural and too deep to be addressed by investment and regeneration. The managed decline of Liverpool, he argued, was the more honest policy option. The word used in the memorandum was managed decline. The memorandum was circulated within the Cabinet. It was read by senior ministers. Margaret Thatcher herself received it. The public response to the riots, the Heysel visits, the regeneration announcements, the Garden Festival, continued as the public face of the government's Liverpool policy. The managed decline memorandum was the private face. It sat in government archives for 30 years. It was released in January 2011 under the 30-year rule. When it was released, its contents were reported widely. Geoffrey Howe died in October 2015. He was asked about the memorandum in interviews before his death. He defended its logic. He argued that the assessment of Liverpool's structural economic problems was accurate. He did not argue that the recommendation of managed decline was wrong. No minister has been held accountable for writing or circulating a document that recommended allowing a British city and its people to fail. The people of Liverpool did not know, for 30 years, that their government had written this document about them. The people who experienced the Toxteth riots, who lived through the unemployment of the 1980s, who sent their children to the schools that were being cut, who used the services that were being reduced, did not know that a cabinet memorandum described their city as not worth saving. They were living in the managed decline that the memorandum had recommended, without knowing that its recommendation had been made. Geoffrey Howe is buried in the churchyard of St. Mary the Virgin in Ickleford in Hertfordshire. The people whose city he recommended allowing to decline are still in Liverpool. Some of them found out in 2011 what had been written about their city in 1981. Some of them found out what their government had decided about them and their future 30 years after the decision had been made. No one apologized. No one was held accountable. The memorandum is in the National Archives. Liverpool is still here. Both of those facts are true simultaneously, and the distance between them, the distance between a document that recommended a city's managed decline and the city that survived in spite of that recommendation, is the distance between what the British state decided about Liverpool and what Liverpool decided about itself.